So, we are going to spend some time now on another international case study, this one from the EU. There is a huge amount we can learn from the European Union's progress on carbon and housing to help us address the fact that so many Kiwi homes are damp or mouldy, like Eloise's flat by the sound of it. So what policy levers to decarbonise have worked elsewhere? Caroline Lambert is Head of Trade for the European External Action Service to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Caroline has decades of experience in policy design and working across energy, transport, climate and environmental policy, as well as in budgetary and financial affairs. So I guess she brings together the two sides of this equation. Get your questions in, because we're hoping to have a little bit of time for a Q&A with Caroline, but please give Caroline Lambert a warm welcome.
Kia ora koutou, ko Caroline Lambert, taku ingoa, no wiwi haho, he takawanga kawanatanga o te ko tahitonga Europi haho. I work for the European Union in Wellington. I'm Head of Trade and Green Diplomacy, and it's a pleasure to be here with you to talk to you about our journey towards greening our buildings in the European Union. No, I'm pushing the wrong button. Yeah. So we've started this journey over 20 years ago already, but it's now embedded in what is called the Green Deal that you may have heard of, which we decided in 2019, well before COVID and the war in Ukraine broke out. The Green Deal is the EU's commitment to become the world's first carbon neutral, climate neutral continent. Because we only emit 8% of the world's emissions, our commitment is to also show the world what it is possible to do to inspire others to follow suit. This was decided as a solidarity project within the European Union, as a sustainability project, but things have changed a little bit since the war broke out in Ukraine. That's because it's now also an energy security imperative for us, and it's also a social emergency. Our energy prices, both electricity and natural gas prices, have been multiplied by 10 since last year. So this has focused minds, particularly because 8% of the EU's population was already in energy poverty. And so it is now the utmost priority ahead of winter to ensure that everyone can have a safe and comfortable winter. So I'll explain a little bit what we have deployed so far that has worked, what hasn't worked, and what we're planning now to accelerate decarbonization quicker, further. We've decided to have a roadmap, so to chart the way towards net zero by deciding what each sector would need to deliver. But before I go into what each sector deliver, I'll go through the key principles of our road towards net zero. That's what I've called cardinal principles on the top right corner of the slide. The first being energy efficiency first. Of course, the cleanest and the cheapest energy is the one that you do not use. It's actually a source of energy. It's a sink. We are making sure that everything we do is not only decarbonizing our electricity, but actually using as little as possible. The second principle, once this one is ticked, is to electrify and make sure our electricity is as renewable as possible. It is not only about new generation, but it's also about allowing self-generation, decentralized generation, and digitalizing electricity. So lots of investments, including in buildings, to make them smart and digitalized. The third principle is circular economy. That is to ensure that we stay within planetary boundaries and we create a business model where we don't destroy value through a product's life or a building's life. We actually keep value into the products and into the buildings so that these materials can enter a second cycle of use. The fourth principle is that for the first time in the European Union, apart perhaps in the Netherlands, we have to take into account spatial constraints very seriously because there are opportunity costs to what we use land for. We need to produce food, we need to locate energy, we need to have room for biodiversity, and also to house Homo sapiens. And that means that density of housing has to increase. In Europe, it's already a lot more dense than what you have here in New Zealand, but we've got to move towards more densification. So what does it mean for sectors? The blue line that you can see is our GDP. As you can see, we've improved our GDP, grew our GDP by 60% in 1990. And the red line is our emissions. So we've decreased our emissions already by 30% since 1990. However, the bulk of our emissions reductions so far were in the energy sector. The building sector is residential and tertiary, so there are the two yellowish lines that you can see. They have been decreasing a bit, but not in a major way yet. But we want them to go to zero. So the way we think about going to net zero is for some sectors to go to growth zero. So that is no emissions, no need for offsets. The sectors that need to go to zero are electricity, buildings, waste, and land transport. The sectors that we believe will not be at zero by 2050, hence we will need carbon sinks, be they natural or technological solutions, are aviation, shipping, agriculture, and the harder industrial sectors to decarbonize. So these two say we will not use offsets for our building emissions. This is not the plan. The plan is to bring all of our buildings to zero. We have an interim target, that's a 2030 target of minus 55% of our emissions. With the new legislation that we are passing in an emergency with the war, we're probably going to achieve a lot more than minus 55%. Now, the question that we ask ourselves is how much should building contribute to that interim target? And the answer is we need to reduce. The cost-effective answer through our modelers is that we need buildings to decrease emissions by 60% by 2030 compared to what it was in 2015. And we also have calculated what that means for energy consumption and energy use for heating and cooling. The blue line is emissions reduction so far in the building stock, in the EU building stock. So we have managed to reduce our emissions already, despite the fact that our building stock has increased. And that's the result of 20 years of policy making already in this area. However, we would like to go towards the green line. And the baseline is the blue line. So that would not bring us to minus 60% emissions. And that's the baseline of the current policy that we have in place. The red line is the current policy plus an improvement of our ETS, an improvement of our renewable energy target, but nothing specific to the building sector. And yes, we get a bit more, but we're not meeting our green target. So this is how our economists have convinced our policymakers to go for building-specific legislation to ensure that we bring the building sector to where it needs to be as part of the burden sharing across sectors. How can we explain the decrease of emissions so far? The first thing to mention that is very rarely known outside the European Union is that we have energy rationing already in place in the European Union through legislation. Every year, our energy providers have to sell 1.5% less energy year on year. This is the idea that no one should make money out of selling more energy when actually we need to use less. So the idea is to change the business model towards selling energy services rather than kilojoules per se. So this has had a strong impact on energy use in our buildings, as you can see. The other reason through which we explain this decrease of emissions is new building design rules that we've set up in 2002 already. Some renewables integration that has happened over time with a decrease of solar panel prices in particular, and a warming climate, meaning that we've had to heat our homes less in the recent winters. What is the policy mix that we used in the last 10 years? Some are similar to the New Zealand one, some do not exist here as far as I can say. So we have national climate and energy plans, so our 27 member states, the countries that make up the European Union, we'll call them member states. They each have to have a plan, a decadal plan for their energy and their climate emissions. They also need to have a long-term strategy to go to zero. That's similar to the one I've shown you with the colors and the graph. And they need to have long-term renovation strategies for their building stock. So we've asked the 27 member states to tell us what's their plan to bring their buildings down to zero in 2050, and how it fits with the overall picture of their climate decarbonization. So this has been in place for over a decade now. We've also had energy performance certificates. They were legislated 20 years ago. So yeah, they've been mentioned throughout the day. Usually when in some of our member states you see similar policies, they originate from the European Union. What they do is that they describe so they are compulsory at rent when you buy a building, so at selling stage or renting stage. They describe what's the emissions, the energy performance of a building. That's compulsory. Sometimes in some member states they went further already and asked for emissions performance of the building. They also describe how much it costs to warm, cool, and light that building for a typical family. And some of them also explain how you can bring cost-efficient energy efficiency improvements to your building. So they have an advisory part as well. They are also publicly displayed in publicly owned buildings, or in any building, commercial building, for example, that is frequented by public. We've had deadlines to ensure that every new building would be near zero energy. It was end of 2018 for publicly owned building and end of 2020 for the other buildings. That also captures renovations. If someone invests in renovating a building for more than 25% of the floor area, or injects 25% of the value of the existing building into renovation, then that building is considered a new building and also needs to be near zero energy post-renovation. Now, near zero energy doesn't mean the same across the European Union. We've set some minimum performance requirements that take into account different climates and different uses of the building. So a near zero energy hospital, for example, is allowed to use a bit more energy than a residential home. It depends on what type of activity will take place in that building. We have compulsory bi-yearly inspections of boilers and of air conditioners now. We've got electromobility requirements in every new building or renovated building, so that it's either pre-plugged for a privately owned building for EV charging, or has already the plugs in for a commercial building or a multi-dweller building. Each European country also had to promote on the website the financing smart schemes to help households invest in energy efficiency, so that there was a one-stop shop for anyone or SMEs, anyone interested in making these energy efficiency investments. So all of these efforts date from either 2002 or 2010 or 2018, which was the last time that we upgraded that legislation. We're doing a new upgrade now. What are our lessons learned? We were quite proud of seeing that energy efficiency improvements worldwide, investments worldwide, 40% of them come from the European Union. So we only represent 6% of the world's population, 15% of the GDP in power purchase parity, but 40% of energy efficiency investment worldwide are done in the European Union. Still, it was too slow. We are only deeply retrofitting a tiny percent of our building stock each year, and it would take us centuries to reach net zero throughout the whole building stock. So we decided to accelerate, and some of the roadblocks that we identified is that our energy performance certificates, they were too lax in the sense that they were only giving information. They were not legal in the sense providing for the compulsory upgrade of a building. So I'll come to what we had decided about this later. We've also found out that our construction standards, building products standards were lagging behind. There were some standardization specific to certain EU member states coming up. And in the EU, if you want to achieve economics of scale from a large market, you need to have the same standards across all member states. As soon as some member states are starting to design their own system, it raises costs for everyone else. So we also need to tackle that. There was a lack of adequate financing for households to do these energy retrofits. There were split incentives between owners and renters, between multi-owners buildings as well. And we had a strong skills gap in the construction sector. So we've decided when we presented our upgraded legislation last year, and then we also upgraded it this year, to upgrade our certificates, to have state public intervention, EU intervention in the standardization of construction products, to have an affordability strategy to push for skills development in the construction sector, and also have three main overarching horizontal policies around smart building, that's digitalization, the use of data from buildings into a single data log where everyone can access data over life course of a building, those that need to, circular solutions, and a higher health and climate resilience focus. So what does this mean? We first have new upgrades to the overall use of energy in the EU. That's not building specific. The first is rationing of natural gas. So we need to use 15% less natural gas by March next year. This was decided just a few weeks ago to ensure that we wean ourselves off Russian fossil fuels as soon as possible. So that member states are going about their own way about doing that. It can include mandated temperature levels in publicly owned buildings or commercial buildings as well. We are looking at a power and electricity rationing as well, but the details are not yet decided, so you need to read that in the papers in the weeks to come. We've also upgraded our renewables legislation. The idea is that each member state has to deliver 49% of energy use in buildings from renewables. And we've upgraded the legislation I mentioned, whereby we mandate less energy sold in the EU each year. I said it was 1.5% year on year, and we bring that to about 2% year on year, which should allow us to increase our energy efficiency target to about 30% in 2030 compared to baseline. We also want the public sector to lead the way, and that means that we've asked our member states to renovate 3% of public buildings floor area by 2030, and that's 10% of the EU's buildings are owned by the public sector. So it's quite a strong push towards creating the solutions and lowering the price for the private sector. So what are the new rules? For new buildings, we're going away from near zero energy towards zero emissions. So it's a new way of defining emissions in buildings, and that will include embedded emissions first, not as going to zero, but as an information. And we're going towards compulsory renewable integration onto every new building. For the worst performing buildings, they will have to reach a minimum standard by a certain date, otherwise they won't be able to be sold or rented. Planning and information tools, we have what are called building passports. So it can take 15 to 20 years to renovate a building because usually people don't have the bulk of money to invest the all in the go, so you do it step by step. But if you happen to then sell your building in the meantime, or then the information can get lost. So the idea is that each building will have a building passport with a data log that subsequent owners and architects and builders or consultants will be able to access to see how the building, the data evolving from the buildings over time. That will also help banks designing products, financial products that work for that house, for these family in terms of retrofitting the building. Construction products, so yes, I mentioned we're getting involved in the standardization process, but we also are changing our eco-design rules for construction products to ensure that they deliver a minimum energy efficiency performance, a minimum benchmark in terms of embedded emissions, as well as recycled content. So our new certificate will now have letters, so you will either, hopefully you will live in an A building, that is a zero energy building, and going towards a zero emissions building. And G, everywhere in the EU, will be the 15% less, the 50% worse buildings. And all the other letters, they will be allocated by proportioning the percents in between G and A. We'll have an enhanced common template that will allow banks to also offer financial services for upgrading buildings across borders in the European Union. And these energy performance certificates will have a shorter validity, so people will have to do them more often, and particularly for the G and F buildings. So all new buildings will now have to be Class A, and the remaining energy needs for that building will have to be on-site renewable. All renovations, similarly, will have to be bring buildings to Class A. We'll have the global warming potential of new buildings calculated as from 2030, and we'll have compulsory e-mobility integration. So I mentioned so far the pre-cabling for EVs, but we want to also have bicycle parking. That's compulsory in new multi-dweller buildings, for example. For existing buildings, the big new proposal is the phase-out. So we want to, for public and commercial buildings, we want to phase out the G and the F buildings before the end of this decade, and for residential building starting at the start of the next decade. And each of our member states have to set up timelines for the rest of the stock to reach the higher letters, I mean the former letters of the alphabet. Yeah, so this graph explains the deadlines for phasing out the G and F buildings and the million tons oil equivalent energy savings that will manage through that. So this requires money, of course, and not all the finance will come from households or the private sector, but a major part will come from households and the private sector. So we believe that by using public finance to 10 to 15% of the overall cost of retrofitting, we can help everyone pay for retrofits on average, because by pay-as-you-save schemes or concessional loans. So we are setting up funds, both at EU level and national level, to help people bring their building to a higher standard. So we have a fund in the EU called Repower EU that we've just decided March, right after the invasion of Ukraine, which is focusing on energy efficiency improvement, heat pumps, and solar rooftops, and is helping commercial banks throughout the European Union with designing loans that would be zero interest rates for retrofittings. We have also in our recovery package that was decided on after COVID, but before the war, we had set aside a big, large pot of money for what is called the renovation wave. Our idea was to create jobs and relaunch, kickstart the economy again. And our member states are busy implementing these energy efficiency support schemes and retrofits throughout the landscape. And we want to set up something new, which would be called the Climate Social Fund, which would use proceeds from the EU ETS to help the most vulnerable, the energy poor, leapfrog to energy efficient homes. So the idea is that we would either provide temporary income support or do the investments for this category of the population that cannot possibly do the investments and that is not already in a social housing scheme. So these are a sample of stories, energy efficiency retrofit stories in the EU. The 70 billion spent are only EU money. On top of this, you've got the private money and the national member states money that have been spent already this year. So Italy has been quite in the news with their 110% reimbursement of the costs of renovation through tax deductions. France has a rent increase ban for those properties that are the worst, poorly performing. Germany has a big spending plan the years ahead. Ireland, it's been mentioned, also has one. And their energy authority has a great database of energy performance certificates, so they know where the worst buildings are. Spain is also has some very ambitious plans. So it's just a sample, but our 27 member states are really busy providing schemes, smart financial schemes, so that investments are flowing. I mentioned we need to upskill our construction sector from from the architect down to the solar panel installer. And we have what's called the Build Up Initiative, which is a portal where we share knowledge on how to make buildings more efficient in 23 languages. We also have a skills initiative where we are creating trainings, webinars, ask the expert free questions in 23 languages for our building professionals. We have a research program that's looking at business models for deep innovations, and we recently agreed a specific pact for solar pact for skills. So we've decided a great layout of solar panels across the European Union, but we're not sure we have the professionals to install them. I mentioned acceleration. So before the illegal and unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine of 24th of February, we imported 40% of our gas from Russia. Today, we're at 9%. But we want to get rid of Russian fossil fuel as soon as possible. And as part of that drive, we have some building-specific initiatives. One is called the European Solar Rooftop Initiative. So all new buildings now will need to be designed to be optimally solar ready, and there's mandatory solar energy installations on new public and commercial buildings already by the end of 26, and then as you see, the dates change whether it's existing buildings or new residential buildings. We've also created in law a right for multi-apartment building dwellers to exercise their right to collective self-consumption, meaning if these are blockades, we can have a judicial system to ensure that rights can be exercised. And we're setting up financial support to ensure that across the European Union, there are payback times of maximum 10 years for these installations. And we have a free software that every household can go into the web, type your street address, and the software will look at your roof with satellite and tell you what is the solar energy potential of your roof. That helps then households, have quotes designed for their roofs at a very low price. We want to double the rate of deployment of heat pumps in the next 5 years, and we've worked with the banking sector to create an energy efficiency financial institution coalitions to look at green mortgages and also scaling up actually the financial sector to provide these loans. Expected benefits, well, I guess there is the same as in New Zealand, so I won't talk too much about this. It ticks all the right boxes. So, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Caroline. That was a fascinating presentation, and there's so many questions here for you, but we'll get through those that we can. What has the EU done to support suppliers to lower carbon in their manufacturing and operations?
So the suppliers of building products? Well, we have the world's largest research, development and innovation program. A large part of it is to help develop the new technological solutions. But apart from that support, we're also actually legislating to push the sector to innovate and create these new solutions.
I think this is a little tongue-in-cheek. Can Aotearoa join the EU? More seriously though, what is being done to bring these EU practices and learnings to New Zealand so that we can adopt these workable changes faster? Because it's clear you're ahead of where we're at now. So obviously you're speaking here today and telling us about it. What else can we do to fast-track what you're doing and bring it here?
Thank you very much for the question. It is the purpose of my being here today. That's part of our green diplomacy. I've had the opportunity to talk to MB officials, so I've been very happy to be able to share some of our stories already. And very welcome to engage in an enhanced dialogue with this. Not only do we have the EU story, but actually our member states often go 27 different ways of reaching the same outcome. So it's like a laboratory of policy experiences, and that we like to regularly reflect upon, draw lessons, and then share insights with our partners, close partners like New Zealand, that are determined to go to net zero.
And I heard a sharp intake of breath when you talked about how quickly and how sharply you're having to reduce your reliance on Russian gas. So we sympathise, but it's pushing things along, isn't it? Please put your hands together for Caroline Lambert.